Welcome to Eat Clean 19. Today I'm going to show you a delicious dinner or lunch option that you can use that can satisfy that pasta craving, and we're going to use spaghetti squash instead. So this is the spaghetti squash, and it's going to be paired with some tangy balsamic vinegar, some olive oil, some sun-dried tomatoes or cherry tomatoes, your choice, some feta cheese, and I'm also going to make a meat sauce to complement it. So stay tuned for this delicious recipe. Today, what I'm choosing for my protein source is going to be this lean turkey. So there's protein source. Now if I look back to my 5 Habits cheat sheet, second thing, where are the veggies? In today's meal, we've got spaghetti squash is going to be the main veggie component. We've also got some cherry tomatoes. You can use sun-dried tomatoes instead or in addition to. I love the sun-dried tomatoes, so we're going to do a combination of those. The tomato sauce could be considered part of your veggie component as well. And I just have on hand, just in case, some extra diced tomatoes if I find that the sauce needs a little bit more tomato-y substance to it. So if you were making this meal, you may want to throw on some pasta as well. I'm not going to. The other option for a starchy carb that you could do, which I'm going to add to this meal, is going to be black beans. This meal, the fats are going to come from olive oil. We're going to add some olive oil to the squash once it's cooked, and a little bit of feta cheese, okay? Oh, I almost forgot for your ingredient list, basil. You definitely need basil. Fresh basil is lovely. Just forgot it, but I happen to have some dried in the in my pantry, and it works just as well. So those are my meal components. So if you can make sure that you've got all of these things, then you'll be able to follow along with this meal. In terms of what you need, kitchen supplies, you're going to need an oven. You need to preheat that to 375 degrees. You need a large bowl to mix the spaghetti squash mixture up with. You're going to need a baking pan to put the spaghetti squash on. You're going to need a nice chopping board and good sharp knife to cut open that spaghetti squash. So I'll walk you through it, I'll show you the different parts, and I'll show you how that beautiful meal all comes together, and then how you portion it out to make sure it's the appropriate portion size for your families. So the first step, oh, by the way, one thing you also do need in the ingredients or materials list, some measuring spoons. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up this spaghetti squash, and this is where you definitely want a good knife. You'll see as I do this, you probably still need a fair bit of muscle, and you want to make sure you have, no honey, you want to make sure that you have no children's fingers around ready to get in the way. So there's no wonderful technique to do this other than try to split it down the middle, the lengthwise, and try to get it as symmetrical as possible. And again, good knife is very important. So there we go, I've got this open. Now what we're going to do is we're going to scoop out all the seeds. Once the seeds are scooped out, it takes a little bit of time, so I won't... Yeah, you can help me do this in a second. Once you take out the seeds, then you'll be ready to pop that in the oven. So in order to scoop out the seeds, you can see what I'm doing is I'm just kind of scraping along the edges until I've got the seeds loosened, and then I'm going to take that into my compost. Now you'll notice once I do this, there's some stringy bits left. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep scraping, and I might take a little knife to clean that up a little bit. If there's a little bit of this stuff left, I'm not too concerned, but I do want to clean that up a little bit. So I won't make you watch that whole thing, but I'll show you what that looks like, final product. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to slide it into the oven, which has been preheated to 375. Squash is cooking. I'm going to do that for half an hour at 375. I'll check it halfway. As the squash is cooking, I've got the turkey bone. If you are a vegetarian, if you are not going to do the meat, then I would suggest definitely using black beans in the recipe, and that functions as your lean protein. Again, if you look. Okay, so here we are over by the meat sauce, and what I've added into this large pot is we've got all of the cooked ground turkey. We've got one container of tomato sauce, and I definitely did want the full large can of diced tomatoes. I think that's going to be important. And then your options here, if you want to include and put right in this sauce, if you do want to add starchy carbs to the meal for all of the people who are eating the meal, then I would recommend adding the black beans right in. Because for this meal, I want to have the option of eating this meal with or without the starchy carbs. I'm going to add those in very last when I'm actually portioning the meals out. So I'm going to keep the meat sauce as is. That way I can have this meal as either completely starchy carb free, or I can add starchy carbs should I choose to. As you can see, I've just taken the spaghetti squash out of the oven. I don't know if you can see the steam, it's been in there for about a half hour. If you can see, I'll try to hold this up without burning myself. There is just a nice hint of brown to the spaghetti squash. That's one of the ways that you can see that it's done. The other way that you don't want it overly charred, but just a tiny bit of brown. The other thing you can do is you can gently pull the flesh away, and if it comes off and makes almost, good job, buddy. It makes little bits of spaghetti looking like squash, you know that it's cooked properly. So you can, what I would definitely recommend doing before we piece everything together is let that cool for about 10 minutes, because it's really, really hot and you have the chance of burning yourself. So what you can do in the meantime, while you're waiting, hopefully you can hear me over Jake's playing, is you can chop up some cherry tomatoes. So what I've done there is I've chopped up about half the container of the cherry tomatoes. I'm using that entire bag of sun-dried tomatoes. Sun-dried tomatoes. If you've never worked with the dried sun-dried tomatoes, all that I've done is I've poured boiling water over top of them, and then I'm going to cut them up into really fine pieces. I'm going to take about half of this 200-gram bit of goat's feta cheese. You can use regular feta cheese, that's fine. And I'm going to chop that up nice and fine, and that will be the components of what we're going to do for the squash. I've also rinsed the black beans, so that's something you'll want to do as well. So go ahead and get working on yours. Okay, so now we're going to put together the delicious spaghetti squash part. First thing you're going to want to do, now that the spaghetti squash has cooled down a little bit, is to take all the really nice spaghetti squash and scrape it into your bowl. Try to get as much of that flesh off as possible, and you should be left with just basically a very thin skin. So I'm going to take my time and do that. You go ahead and do yours, and then I'll meet you back for the next step. So that's what you should end up looking like, just a very thin shell once you've scraped all the flesh out. Toss that in my compost. And now for the final bit here, I'm going to take my basil. So you could use, if I was doing this with fresh basil, basically I would take an entire amount of the fresh basil that you get, you get the little packages at the store. I would do that whole thing in here. Or I'm going to take 1 tablespoon of the dry basil. I'm going to sprinkle that in. Now all of the measurements that I'm going to suggest today are starting points. What I would really suggest is that you taste test once it's complete and decide whether or not you want to add a little bit more or a little bit less of the basil, and definitely the balsamic vinegar as well. So I'm going to put 3 tablespoons of olive oil in here. There's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. And I will do a 1-to-1 ratio starting of balsamic to olive oil, but I really enjoy the taste of balsamic. So quite often what I'll do is I'll put this all together, mix it all together, and then I usually go back and add a little bit of balsamic vinegar. So we'll see what I do this time. So there is our 3 bits of balsamic vinegar, or 3 tablespoons. Then I'm going to add all these items in. So this was 100 grams of the feta cheese. I'll put that in, and then I've got half of a container of cherry tomatoes, and then I've got my sun-dried tomatoes, which, by the way, again, just a reminder, if you're using the dried sun-dried tomatoes, all you do is put boiling water on top, rinse them, and then drain them, and then I chop them up nice and fine. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my spoon and fork, and I'm going to spend a few minutes mixing this all up so it all combines nicely together. And I'll be back and we'll explain the final steps. Okay, so now just finally time to put together a meal. So we've got the meat sauce, so I did that with, again, the tomato sauce and the ground turkey. As an option, I'm showing you, if you find that this extra step is too much time, because this is an additional step, how you can put together a meal with, say, just a plain chicken breast and make this a complete meal. So if I'm using the spaghetti sauce, this is a female portion, so what I've done is I've taken 1 scoop, or approximately 1 fist size, of the meat sauce, and then I want to put, I decide whether or not I want starchy carbs. Let's say that in this case I do want starchy carbs added to this. I would recommend putting the black beans on top. For a female, I'm going to say probably 3/4 of a cup is closest to your fist size. For a male, you might want to go with slightly larger, maybe a cup, and I'm just going to sprinkle that over top. You may want to heat the beans up just a little bit if they're not warm enough. And then we take a nice amount of the delicious spaghetti squash, and there is a lovely meal. Now for females, if you're hungry, take a little extra spaghetti squash. Start with that, but I'm pretty sure that should be quite filling. Again, if you didn't work out or you're trying to lose weight, you may want to minimize that serving of starchy carbs or eliminate it altogether. Now let's say for the males, you wanted to just go with a starchless dinner, then what you've got is, and if we chose not to create the meat sauce, you might have a large chicken breast instead. So you take a chicken breast the size of 2 palms, so that would be equivalent to about 2 palms. So that's a large chicken breast, maybe slightly small for a large male, but about right for most. You can see that if this was for a female portion, I'd want to cut that about in half or 2/3 of that. And then we give a nice large serving of our delicious spaghetti squash. So we're going to do 2 fistfuls worth of the spaghetti squash. So there is a delicious, very healthy meal using either minimal or very healthy choice of starchy carbs and lots of lovely veggies. Talk to you soon.